Welcome to the Celiac Diaries podcast. I'm your host, Lucia Cordero, and this is where we get real about life with celiac disease. Each week, I'll share practical gluten-free tips, wellness hacks, and honest conversations about the emotional side of living with an autoimmune condition. Think of this as your weekly mix of support, relatability, and inspiration to help you not just survive, but thrive with celiac. Before we dive in, just a quick reminder, I'm not a medical professional. Everything I share is based on my own experience living with celiac disease. This podcast is not medical advice, so please always consult your doctor about your own health. Hi, welcome back to the Celiac Diaries podcast. I'm your host, Lucia Cordero, and we have a very, very special guest in studio, our first dietitian on the pod, Jessica Lebovits. I'm so excited you're here. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh my gosh, I'm just so honored that you're spending your time with us today. You're an internationally recognized celiac disease expert and specialist. You personally have celiac disease, Hashimoto's, reflux, osteopenia, and PCOS.
Yes.
So you come from personal experience and expert experience, and I'm just so excited to have such an informative conversation with you for our listeners today.
I'm so excited to share. I think this will be really great. I find that it's hard to share a lot of this information over social media, so I think podcasts are a really fun way to share this, and I really love what you're doing with it.
Oh my gosh, thank you. Yeah, we're going to do a deep dive on all things celiac disease and diet related, hearing from an expert. Also, a bunch of you guys submitted some questions on our Instagram at Celiac Diaries Pod, so we're going to get into all of those towards the end of the episode. And yeah, so I'm curious because I don't know, when did you get diagnosed with celiac disease?
So I was diagnosed about 2014, so it's been about 12 years.
Okay, wow.
So you were 2012, is that right?
2011. So around the same time. Yeah.
So similar times. I was in my senior year of college when I was diagnosed. So I was actually already studying nutrition at the time, and then I got diagnosed in my senior year. Yes.
Okay, because I was going to ask if you got diagnosed with celiac disease and then became passionate about nutrition, but you already knew you wanted to be a dietitian before.
Yeah, I was already a nutrition major, and then I was already on the path to becoming a registered dietitian. Mm-hmm. And then my senior year is when I officially got diagnosed with celiac disease. Mm-hmm. So I did not become a dietitian because of celiac disease. Wow. I was already on that path, and then that kind of pushed me in the direction of celiac disease and GI nutrition later on.
Yeah, and did you have a specialty in mind before you were diagnosed that was different or no?
So I didn't do my registered dietitian internship until after college. So I was already in that program. And then I spent a number of years in hospitals working with all different types of patients. I really wanted a background on all different types of conditions so that when, yes, people have celiac disease, but do they also have heart disease, diabetes, thyroid disease, all different types of conditions? I wanted to feel comfortable being able to treat the whole person and all different conditions and dietary restrictions. So I spent a number of years inpatient in hospitals in New York City. And then I also I started doing celiac disease nutrition counseling on the side. And that's kind of where I started. And then I've been at Columbia Celiac Disease Center for 8 years now.
Wow, amazing. That's such an incredible career journey.
Yeah, it's been really fulfilling. I think that treating celiac disease as a dietitian is really a great career because the diet is the treatment. So dietitians are so valuable to the treatment of celiac disease. So Exactly. It feels like I'm making a big difference, and patients are really motivated to work with dietitians and to work on their diet. So it feels like an area of nutrition that has been just really fulfilling overall.
Yeah, cool. And if you don't mind sharing what led to your diagnosis.
Yeah. So I was experiencing reflux. I didn't really think much of it because I was in college and I just felt like my lifestyle, precipitated reflux. It wasn't that big of a deal.
Totally. And lifestyle in college, it's like it could be anything.
Right. And so I actually had studied abroad in Italy. Right before that, I was eating bread and pasta all the time. I love bread and pasta. I still do, obviously. Mm-hmm. But I didn't really think it was a big deal. And then my mom finally took me to a gastroenterologist who ran the blood work, and it came back positive. And we laughed at him. We're like, that's not possible. I love bread and pasta and pretzels. That's all I eat. Even though I was a nutrition major. And eventually they were like, no, you really do have celiac disease. And so then I eventually accepted, obviously, that's what it was. I went on a gluten-free diet. I went to the Celiac Disease Center at Columbia myself. And looking back, I may have had celiac disease for longer. I did grow up with constipation and stomach pain. I was small and probably didn't maybe grow to my potential. And then, as you mentioned, I do have osteopenia. So I did find that when I was diagnosed that I did have some bone loss. So that could have been related to that.
Okay, so you found out about osteopenia at the same time.
Yeah, around the same time.
Interesting. And we'll get more into osteopenia-related things later and how that can be treated with diet too. But I also have osteopenia. But I got diagnosed with that like 2 years ago. So much longer after I had celiac disease.
Yeah. It depends when the doctor recommends taking a bone density. So, it could be that that's just the time when you end up getting checked for it, because obviously that's a silent symptom. People don't know that they have osteopenia until they're checked for it.
Exactly. Okay, so we're going to get into our segments that we have. First up is Gluten-Free Fave of the Week.
So this is super relevant to what we were just talking about.
Okay.
So this week, I just started taking this calcium chew. It's called Scene, and Megan Donnelly is the dietitian at Celiac Disease Foundation. She told me about it, and I was really excited because it's a chew, not a gummy, and not a pill, that is made from real food ingredients, and it has 500 milligrams of calcium in there. And it comes in these little cute packets, and they taste good. There's no like added sugar. It's just made from a little bit of dates. I find it extremely tough to get enough calcium and for my patients to get enough calcium. And then you run into the troubles of constipation as well. So I was really excited about this one. This was a brand new product that I just found out about.
That is so amazing. I'll have to check it out. Yeah. My endocrinologist did not recommend actually taking a calcium supplement. They just recommended that I take vitamin D and then try to get calcium from my diet. But whenever I go back for my next bone density scan, then we're going to see if that actually helped things. And then if not, I'm going to have to take a calcium supplement.
So what I work on with patients is generally we need 1,000 milligrams of calcium per day. So anyone who's 19 to 50 years old, that's your calcium requirements for the day. So what I work on with my patient is estimating if they are getting to that 1,000 on a daily basis through food. So ideally, everyone can get through food, but it's extremely tough. And I find that it's tough for me, even though I know all the things. It's just really hard to get all of the nutrients you need in a day. And so I like that this one wasn't actually, it's not technically a supplement. It's actually coming from food. So if you find that you are meeting your needs through food, you don't need supplementation, and we don't recommend overdoing it. Basically, if you find that you get up to a certain amount, we kind of look at what that deficit is of what you need 1,000 milligrams per day and what you're getting to, and then maybe just supplement whatever it is you're not getting. Or can you add in calcium-rich foods like a glass of milk or yogurt or cheese or something like that?
I need to recalculate how many milligrams I'm getting per day, because it's so easy to just fall behind on that. Yeah. Okay, next up we have our gluten-free news of the week. So this has been all over social media. I don't know if you've seen it. I'm sure you have. So a new study shows that wheat-based biodegradable plates can transfer gluten to food. Essentially, there's this wheat-based plate that is all around social media. People are very scared about it, which is transferring enough gluten into foods, which is above the safety threshold for gluten-free labeling. The study shows that contamination is worse with liquids and creamy foods, as well as hot foods, because there's longer contact times with those and there's increased gluten transfer. And it also highlights a regulatory gap because these plates, cups, and straws don't have to disclose allergen content, meaning that someone with celiac disease could unknowingly purchase this type of plate that has wheat and not really understand what's in it. So I'm curious your thoughts. Do you think everyone kind of being really nervous about this, is that valid? What should we really be concerned about with this, if anything?
Yeah, so the study that was done and what this is based off of was done in Spain. There seems to be a growth of biodegradable tableware and products in Europe, which makes sense. They don't exist right now in the U.S., this particular product that is.
Oh, really?
It's not in the U.S.
Okay.
It's in,
wow.
It was in Spain.
Okay.
And I believe there was another European country that it exists in. So you're not accidentally, like no one's like rushing to their next restaurant and like falling into this. So it's definitely something I'm glad the study exists so that we can be mindful of it. The positive news from this study was that they tested all these other biodegradable tableware and it didn't show that, that there was gluten transfer above 20 parts per million. So that is really good to know. The plate that did show an issue was an eatable or an edible plate. So it's obviously looks different and acts differently because it's actually something that is meant to be eaten. And so I know my celiac patients and, anyone, myself and people with celiac disease, we're cautious and aware. If someone handed you an edible plate, we are probably going to take a second and be like, let me just, let me see if this is okay. So totally. I think that's the message from this is that we want to be cautious and aware, and we want to make sure that we're not just diving into a plate that's edible and putting our gluten-free food on it. So it kind of makes sense. If it's something that's like edible and we put maybe hot liquids on it or our food that is creamy or something like that, some of that, if there's gluten in there or wheat in there, it may transfer into your gluten-free food. So obviously, it would not be recommended for someone with celiac disease to use any of these plates. Like if you were to purchase any of this tableware, it would say wheat or gluten on there. And if it was being served at a restaurant or some sort of establishment, if it says it's edible, I would question that and see if it's really right for you.
That's so fascinating. Yeah, I definitely have not been to a restaurant that serves me an eatable plate.
And if they did, you would be like, are you sure this is okay, right? I don't think you would just dive in.
Totally. Okay, but I have a question because one thing that does give me anxiety with celiac is like going out to a restaurant in New York and they have these different types of straws. They have paper straws. They have straws that are kind of like brownish colored and look like they could be made out of wheat, but it's really hard to tell. Is that something that you're aware of, and is that something that celiacs should be aware of?
Yeah. So basically what we also have to remember is that we have to ingest the gluten, and for generally it needs to be above 20 parts per million to have an effect on our immune system. So the amount that you'd be ingesting from a straw, like you're not eating the straw. Obviously, you can be sucking on the straw, and if it's really degrading, it could potentially be an issue. Some of them potentially could have wheat as a filler. I really haven't been seeing it as an issue with my patients. It's not something I specifically bring up, and I haven't heard people getting gluten reactions from them. Again, I think cautious and aware. Like if you see that and you're not sure and you're someone who's really particularly sensitive, maybe you're not choosing that one. But overall, I don't think patients really need to be overly concerned about them. And I don't think there's a lot of research showing that it's a major concern.
Okay, that's so good to know because that always makes me anxious when I go out somewhere and get like a cocktail or something and there's a straw. And sometimes I'll just take out the straw just for peace of mind and drink it with that one, which I think, is fine if that's going to help me feel less anxious about it.
Right, exactly. I think that we need more research on the paper straws to know for sure. Just from clinical practice, I really haven't been hearing it be an issue for many people or anyone really. But that being said, it could be an issue for someone. So cautious and aware.
Yeah. Okay. Well, good to know. I'm so glad I got that question off my chest.
Of course.
Okay. So in the Celiac Diaries community, we have some people listening that are very newly diagnosed with celiac disease. I get some DMs being like, I just got diagnosed 2 days ago and I found your podcast and I have so many questions. And then there's also people that listen that have had celiac for decades and they're just kind of looking for this community and everything. So I want to start from square one for maybe those listeners that are newly diagnosed. So let's say it's, your first appointment with someone that just got diagnosed with celiac disease. What is kind of the first thing that you tell that patient?
Yeah. So I think you could probably guess that the first question patients ask is, how strict do I need to be? Because they've seen it all online, they've talked to their doctor, they're getting such mixed messages. And so what I tell them right off the bat is that every person with celiac disease is different, and that's why we really individualize our care. So we go through what their tolerance is to gluten, what their sensitivities are, how their healing process goes, what their antibodies look like, what their intestines look like. And we also consider a lot of other factors. So their food security, what phase of life they're in, are they in school, are they in camp, are they at work, are they away from school and college, what their preferences are, their religious preferences. All of those things play a role in how we counsel our patients and what we tell them to do. So it's so important to get that individualized care from specialist dietitians and gastroenterologists. So that is the main question, is how strict do I need to be? And so basically I do go through questions and precautions to take when they're out at restaurants. Of course, the main thing that probably most of your listeners know is that, of course, we are avoiding wheat, barley, rye, malt, and brewer's yeast, that we are cautious with oats, which I know we'll talk about, that I go over how to read labels, I go over resources to use. Those are probably the main takeaways. And we go through, different things at baseline that most patients need to know. And then I say, with time, we're going to see how things are a little bit different for you and what is going to be right for them.
What was the last thing that you said? Wheat, rye, barley, malt?
Brewer's yeast. So that is a beer yeast. It doesn't come up very often.
Okay.
But you don't see it very often, but it is a source of gluten that we tell patients to avoid.
Okay, and what type of products is that in?
I feel like I've seen it in like chips sometimes. Like
really?
Rarely. Like some sort of chip could have it in there. You know what? I need to look and see where it is, but it's very rare that it comes up, but it is something to know.
Okay. I learned something. I never heard that word before.
Yes.
Okay, so I know it's very individualized, but I guess I'm just curious, when someone asks like how strict I need to be, there isn't a world in which you tell some celiacs like, oh, cross-contamination is okay for you, right? Like it's still blanket, like if you have celiac disease, no gluten, no cross-contamination?
So essentially, yes.
Okay.
So I don't tell patients with celiac disease that cross-contamination is okay. That being said, the level of strictness with cross-contamination is probably what I mean when I say like everyone's a little bit different too. So for example, there's, oats. So we'll talk more about oats, but some patients can tolerate oats or more frequent consumption of oats, and some patients can't. And so that's a level of contamination in the oats. Some patients, we're in New York City, some patients dine out 3 times a day, and some patients really, dine out once a month. And some of them are completely fine with dining out 3 times a day. And some of them, that level of contamination that happens with dining out ends up becoming a little bit too much. And we see that through their labs and through their intestines and potentially through symptoms. But that's the major ways that we judge that. Something that's interesting is the fryers. So we have studies supporting that fryers are a source of cross-contamination. And so I do still tell my patients to avoid share fryers. That being said, Celiac Disease Foundation is working on a study checking the amount of gluten contamination in shared fryers for chips and for fries, and to see how much of a risk is it. There's a lot of factors that are involved. So, how often do they change the oil? What other products or foods are going in there that have gluten? So there are some of my patients who we work on that if that's something they really, really want to include in their diet. If they don't have any symptoms, their antibodies are completely normal, and their intestines are completely normal, then maybe a shared fryer here and there might be fine. That doesn't go for everyone. That's somewhat rare at this time. But if we have more research to back that, that might be something that changes some of our guidelines. So it's really important to follow up because our recommendations can change.
Yeah, that is so fascinating, especially the shared fryers. I'm very much like, I always check no shared fryers for me.
Yeah, I don't eat from shared fryers either. And like I said, 98% of my patients I'm telling no shared fryers, but it's individualized.
Yeah, totally. Definitely. Okay, I want to go back to oats because this is such a hot topic.
Such a hot topic.
So I guess a little bit of background on my celiac journey. I was diagnosed at 11 and then for years just wasn't following the gluten-free diet like as strict as I should have been. And then in college was definitely gluten-free, but still having like a lot of cross-contamination. So it wasn't until my early 20s when I like got super serious about cross-contamination. But it was also in my early 20s that I discovered oats, and I saw the gluten-free label on oats, and I had overnight oats like every day for breakfast. I had oat milk that said gluten-free, and I went to the celiac doctor, got my lab work done, and like the levels were just like so insane. And they were like, "Are you sure you're gluten-free?" And then I met with the dietitian, and I was like, "No, I swear, like I actually really the past couple of years have been like so strict about it because I've like finally realized that I need to focus on this." And then we went through everything I ate in a day, and they were like, "Okay, you cannot be having oats anymore." And I was like, oh no, like this is my new favorite food that I found, and I thought it was gluten-free. So can you explain for maybe someone that doesn't know the oat phenomenon?
Yeah. So back when I became a dietitian, I did not realize I'd be talking about oats so much. But oats are such a hot topic. They get talked about all the time in my sessions. So oats are naturally gluten-free, but they're generally grown on the same fields with wheat and other gluten grains. So they just have the highest risk of gluten cross-contact during harvesting and processing. So for that reason, we tell patients with celiac disease, the one major rule is not to have any oat product that doesn't have a gluten-free label. So the oats, for example, like if you have an oatmeal that from Quaker, let's say, for example, that has a gluten-free label versus one that doesn't have a gluten-free label, they're the same oats, but one goes through a protocol to clean them of gluten and then test them to be below the 20 parts per million. And then the other one doesn't.
Certified gluten-free label, right?
Not certified, just regular.
Just regular.
Just a regular gluten-free label.
Okay.
And so that a regular gluten-free label tests products to be below 20 parts per million, and certified gluten-free labels double check the testing that the company does to make sure that it's compliant with that 20 parts per million and sometimes a stricter threshold. So we do make sure that anyone with celiac disease, anytime you're eating oats, whether it's oatmeal, granola bars, oat milk, whatever it may be, those oat products need to have a gluten-free label on them to show that that testing is being done. That being said, there's a lot of factors that go into whether I tell patients to eat oats or continue the oats that they're eating. And I see online a lot of times people saying, you shouldn't eat oats, you should eat oats. But it really, again, depends on the person. And I've worked with the celiac dietitians across the U.S. in giving guidelines on when patients should include oats and when they shouldn't, and when, we would consider taking them out. So things that we consider is frequency. So if you're eating them every day, then that's going to make a much bigger difference than if you're eating them once a month. The type of oat products, so single ingredient oat products, so like oatmeal where it's predominantly oat compared to maybe oat milk where there's a lot of other ingredients. Single ingredient ones are going to have a lot more concentration of oats, and so that's going to be a little bit more risky than something like an oat milk. I mentioned food security before. If you're struggling to buy food and buy gluten-free food, and oats are one of the things that you can afford, or Cheerios are one of the things you can afford, that's obviously going to play a major role in our decision-making of what's going to be right for you. So some patients do completely fine with oats, and we don't change anything. And then a lot of patients who know the gluten-free diet inside and out and are doing everything right, and then they're like, what do you mean my numbers are, elevated? I know how to be gluten-free. Everything's been fine. A lot of times oats are the reason. And so we look at their diet, and sometimes we can adjust what they're doing, and sometimes we eliminate oats, and sometimes we take it out for a time and then add it back in. Totally depends on the situation, the severity of their symptoms or the disease, and also like the phase of life that they're in. If they're in, pregnancy or something, I might be a little bit more strict with things. And if they're, a child in elementary school and they really want to eat those oats, and we can figure out other ways around it and to get their numbers down.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I love your emphasis on like the individualized action plan for every patient, because I think like as a content creator posting about celiac online, and I see this a lot, there's a lot of like, okay, well, my dietitian told me to do this. My doctor told me to do that. But it still is, even though we all have the same disease, it still does show up in different people in different ways. Yeah. Everyone's circumstance is different. I know I have like some friends that have celiac disease and they're perfectly fine with oats. Their levels are normal. And they're just kind of like, oh, well, you're a little crazy that you won't eat oats. And I'm like, well, it actually doesn't work for me.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for people to realize that too, and I think people don't like it when it's not so black and white like that, because it makes it more confusing. Because if you're explaining celiac disease to a new friend and they have a friend that has celiac disease, but they're managing it a little bit differently, then it just creates confusion.
Absolutely. And as you know, I have celiac disease as well. So when I started being gluten-free, my friends are like, well, the people I know with celiac disease don't do that. And I'm like, okay, well.
Yeah, that's a whole nother level when someone is just like choosing to not be gluten-free with celiac.
Right.
That brings us all back,
or
I feel
strict
like.
as, I might be.
Which
is not, I would say I do the things that I need to do, and I'm average strict, but we try not to have our patients be hyper-vigilant either. We want to balance quality of life with compliance. So yes, it's very tough because patients hear different things, and then they, go on social media and say, this is what my dietitian said, and this is what we're all supposed to do. And I will say, I give different advice each session. So I tell a patient they should eat oats until there's a problem. And then they come back in and there's an issue, and then we readdress what's going on. And then I decide, based on my new information, this isn't right for you anymore. So a lot of times I try to keep the oats in, and then we decide whether or not it makes sense.
Yeah, so interesting. You mentioned pregnancy. I'm curious, and it makes sense that maybe someone with celiac would need to make sure they're being more vigilant than maybe they usually are if they're pregnant, since there's a lot going on in the body with that. So how do you advise your pregnant celiac patients differently?
So not so much, more of what I kind of just said. Obviously, nutritionally, there's a lot of things that we talk about to optimize nutrition during pregnancy, because there's a lot of different increased nutrient needs during that phase of life. But I am a little bit more cautious with those patients just because there is a lot going on. We're growing a life. So is that the time to test your tolerance to oats or something that you might not have been eating before? Probably not. Maybe we're not playing around because we don't want you to feel sick during that time when unnecessarily. That being said, if you want to do those things and you want oats in your diet and you want to eat that, that's also perfectly fine. Or if you had oats in your diet before that and then you just continue on and everything is going fine, I wouldn't change that. It's more so I wouldn't be as experimental during that time because of, everything else that's going on.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. If someone with celiac disease was pregnant and maybe before they got pregnant their levels were a little high, would you advise that maybe they wouldn't go out to restaurants as much to just reduce that risk of cross-contamination?
No.
Oh, okay.
We have to live. Right? We have to be able to eat and live. And you can absolutely eat from restaurants safely. Of course, mistakes happen, but that's what I talk about in my sessions is how to go about restaurant eating in a safe way, what questions to ask, what precautions to tell them to take. So I wouldn't tell them not to eat out. If they were elevated before, we would want to try to figure out why. Is it just because they just got diagnosed and, all of their levels are on their way down? Then that wouldn't be a concern. Is it elevated because there's, other gluten exposures in their diet? Then we would want to figure out what those are so that we can get those levels down and limit the inflammation in the body.
Okay, yeah. I love your emphasis on we need to live and have fun, especially if you're living in the city and stuff. It's
of course
such a part of the social culture to go out to restaurants.
Yes.
When my levels were high, my doctor was like, okay, you shouldn't go out to eat for a few months, to restaurants. And I just hated it because that's my social plans were just out the window.
Right. And it's so isolating. And, are there situations where dining out decreases because of, advice that I give or certain restaurants? For sure. But generally, I would say that I want my patients to live as normally as possible. I want them to be able to eat out. I want them to travel. I want them to enjoy good food. I'm a total foodie, and I like my patients to realize that they can still enjoy food while being gluten-free and live their life to the fullest. My whole thing and my whole purpose is to optimize my patients' quality of life, and a lot of the research that I do and along with the other practitioners at Columbia is on quality of life with celiac disease. So I think the emphasis for a lot of years was get gluten out of the diet as much as possible and be as strict as possible to heal. And now they are backtracking because they've seen such a negative impact of hypervigilance on anxiety and mental health and depression and things like that. So we want to really find a middle ground so that we're treating the whole person, as we're treating the intestines, but we're also treating the brain and the mind, and we're not, sacrificing one or the other.
Yeah, I love that message. And I think it's really important for people to hear, because I do get a lot of comments on the podcast sometimes being like, I don't understand, how you guys are going out all the time. Like, I have celiac disease. I feel like I can't leave the house. Like, I can't do anything with friends. And seeing those messages obviously just makes me feel so sad for that person, because I do think everyone with celiac disease should be able to do what they want to do. Maybe it's not going out to eat, but they should feel like they're being able to thrive and have a full life.
And we are extremely privileged. We're in New York City. There's
I know.
so many options, and other areas, and especially more rural areas, there's not as many options, and there's not as many, gluten-free friendly options. But at the same time, when we think about naturally gluten-free foods, proteins, meat, fish, eggs, nuts, seeds, legumes, whole grain, gluten-free whole grains, dairy products, there should be something that we're able to find that we can tell them how to prepare it safely, and so that it should be okay for you. And, communication is really important, and advocacy is really important. And, reaching out ahead of time over email or calling places. If you are feeling like you're so stuck and you haven't been able to dine out, maybe some of that effort proactively before you even get to the restaurant could help, and hopefully you can find something. But that is something in my sessions that we're always talking about, how to go about dining out and how can it work for, each person.
Yeah, I love that advice. You mentioned naturally, like whole gluten-free foods. I know in your Instagram bio, you have like low FODMAP diet, which the past couple of years I've been more interested in. And I feel like in my early 20s, I eat a lot of like frozen Trader Joe's gluten-free meals. And then in the past couple of years, I've shifted to just focusing on like whole natural gluten-free foods. And I mean, I've noticed such a difference in just feeling so much better and having more energy, and obviously getting more protein and more nutrients. But I'm curious, beyond just, having the gluten-free diet with your celiac patients, what other like ways are you working with them? And I know it depends on the individual, but like to optimize their diet beyond just being gluten-free, but how are you working with them on maybe something like a low FODMAP diet to help just have like a calm diet, if that can help potentially with like healing from celiac related damages? I'm curious, like your thoughts on that.
So I work with gastroenterologists primarily. So that's where most of my patients come from. So they are seeing a gastroenterologist maybe because they were diagnosed with celiac disease, but maybe not. So I'll focus on the celiac patients, but a lot of the people I see don't necessarily have celiac, or they have celiac plus something else. So, you can have symptoms for a lot of different reasons. I think a lot of times celiac patients, anytime we have a symptom, we're like, oh, that was gluten. But through my work, I see a lot of it is not related to gluten, and it could be related to so many other dietary triggers or stress or environmental triggers that can cause gastrointestinal symptoms. That's a lot of what I do, is where I play detective and I look through their diet and try to figure out what their triggers are for their symptoms and what types of changes we can make to make those better. So for IBS, a low FODMAP diet is an effective therapy. I think of it much more as an experiment rather than a dietary treatment like gluten-free. So gluten-free is lifelong, obviously. Low FODMAP is basic for people who aren't familiar with FODMAPs. They are types of carbohydrates that induce a lot more symptoms, primarily in people with irritable bowel syndrome or IBS, but it can be in other individuals as well. They cause more gas and bloating, stomach pain, maybe diarrhea, things like that. I often am looking at patients' diets and seeing if there are a lot of high FODMAP foods in there, and whether or not I kind of do a few different versions of trials with that. So during pandemic was a great time to follow a low FODMAP diet because like people weren't dining out nearly as much, and we could do a full version, which means an elimination for approximately 2 weeks. See if you feel better. If you do, then obviously it's related to the elimination of the FODMAPs. If you don't, it's not related, and we go a different direction. Then we reintroduce each FODMAP group one at a time to see which one is the trigger. And then the final phase is the personalization, where we add back in any foods that were tolerated and maybe limit some of the foods that weren't. So that's a brief way of describing it. But now, what I primarily do is I look at the diet and try to figure out which foods are most prevalent in the diet and which ones line up mostly with their symptoms. So I'll often say, okay, you have a ton of garlic and onion in here, which are considered fructans, and a lot of your symptoms are happening after meals with a lot of garlic and onion. So maybe let's do 2 weeks without garlic and onion in your diet and see if you feel better. And if they do, then it's possible we would eliminate, or more realistically, there are now digestive enzymes that help with decreasing the amount of FODMAPs in certain foods so that they can still eat those foods but not have the symptoms to it.
Interesting. One thing I noticed, not even from doing like an elimination diet, and I don't know if this is common or if this is just me, but anytime I have kimchi, I react so poorly. Wow. Like I feel like I'm being gluten. Like I just have the worst stomach pains.
Interesting.
So it could be
for so many reasons because one, some of it's spicy. So the spices in it could be a trigger. It's high fiber for sure. And it's fermented. So some people, based on different conditions, might not react as well to fermented foods. But obviously you were able to identify it on your own. So probably not rushing to eat that again.
Yeah, although it does taste really good. Yeah. But I haven't had it in like a year because I remember last time.
I wonder if different types of kimchi if you would react any differently.
Maybe I'll feel experimental and try it again.
But these are types of things where I kind of talk through with patients different trials to do to figure out what their symptoms are, what foods can they add back into your diet. Like we would say, like maybe we could try a different brand of kimchi. We would also say to start really small. So like comically small, have a bite of something rather than shocking your system with like a whole jar or something like that. Totally. So going very slow and, at the same time of identifying symptoms, we also make sure we're optimizing nutrient intake too. So looking at the diet, seeing if patients are getting enough of their macro and micronutrients, especially since they are already restricting gluten from their diet.
Totally, yeah. I'm curious. I recently did a whole episode about alcohol and celiac disease, but I'm dying to hear from an expert on your opinion on alcohol and, how it affects someone with celiac disease and like the conversations that you have about that with your patients.
Yeah, I don't think I have as much to add specifically for celiac disease. Okay. I think you talked about that alcohol is a toxin. It is inflammatory. So it is adding inflammation to the body. But I think that's for anyone. Right. I don't think that there's enough research to say that it's worse for someone with celiac disease than it is for other patients. I totally see it. Patients with or without celiac disease reacting to alcohol. So I think it's obviously something to consider. I think you're doing dry January right now. So, obviously something to consider in limiting, especially if it triggers gastrointestinal symptoms for you or you're looking to limit inflammation. But I don't know that you need to, just because you're celiac, you can't drink alcohol.
Yeah, totally. Okay. I saw on your Instagram that you ask your patients about their poop, which
of course
makes sense.
Of course, every single time.
So what do we need to know about this, and what should celiacs be looking for in their poop for any like red flags, or how to just be able to tell on their own how their gut is doing?
Yeah. So are you familiar with the Bristol stool chart?
I feel like I've heard of that.
Okay. So it is a chart from 1 to 7. Okay. The top is harder, more constipated stools, and the bottom is looser, more diarrhea type stools. I probably sound like a broken record to my patients because every single session I am asking them where they are on the chart. Okay. It helps me to understand whether they're experiencing, more constipated stools or more diarrhea type stools and how to manage those symptoms. And sometimes people people can have a total range of the type of stool that they're having and how frequent. And it also depends subjectively, like how they feel. Like if they feel fine and they go 3 times a day, great. If they feel like it is a problem and they're going 3 times a day, then that's something that we'll address and try to work on different trials to make that better. So some red flags would be if they see blood in their stool or if there's really sudden changes in their bowel habits. So that's something to definitely talk to a gastroenterologist about, to get medical testing for, just to make sure everything's okay.
All right. So I kind of want to get into some like debunking of celiac myths.
Yeah, let's do it.
I know there's a bunch out there. Since you work with so many patients, what are the biggest mistakes that you see people with celiac making?
I feel like people don't know that much about malt. I feel like that's everyone knows wheat, but they don't really think about malt as much. So that's kind of like the one major thing that sometimes people miss, like malt vinegar, malt flavoring, that they need to know to avoid that. Otherwise, they are still eating malt. And, tricky things like Rice Krispies has malt in it. So, that is something that they would, if they didn't realize malt was gluten, then they would still be eating that.
Totally. And I'm curious if this is something that you work with patients on too, like medications from their doctor or even like over-the-counter medications for like a cold or a flu. Do you work with patients on trying to decipher those ingredients?
Yeah. So it's actually the same ingredients. So you are looking for the same ingredients I mentioned before, the wheat, barley, rye, malt, brewer's yeast. And if it doesn't have those ingredients, and if it doesn't have those ingredients in substantial amounts, it really should be fine. There's almost no like pills or anything that I tell patients to avoid. So I think there's a lot of misinformation on this on the internet. If you look at the inactive ingredients, because it would be that rather than the active ingredients of a medication, and it doesn't have any of those sources, it is fine.
Really?
Yes.
Wow. Okay. Because I have been hearing just completely different things online. And
what
I've
are
been
people saying?
So worried about like checking my medications, talking to my pharmacist, looking up like the manufacturer, if there's like gluten in the facility.
So I wouldn't worry about the facility. They don't do gluten testing. So you're not going to get something that says it's, gluten-free on the label necessarily. Some things do, but it's not very common. Are you familiar with glutenfreedrugs.com?
Yes.
So he's a pharmacist who has looked into the gluten levels in a number of different medications, so that can be a really helpful resource. But generally, we don't find gluten in medications, or the amounts would be processed to be less than 20 parts per million. The things that I would be more cautious with would be anything that is like a liquid or a gummy or a chewable or anything like that. Okay. Those obviously could be a little bit more at risk of having a gluten or wheat ingredient. And supplements, those you would want to have them labeled gluten-free.
Okay. So interesting, because I think that has been a huge discourse online in the gluten-free community.
For sure.
And that feels like a weight lifted off my shoulders, that it's not something we need to be so concerned about.
I wish I was better about like putting all of this stuff out there. I'm not, so that's why we're here. So I can, answer these myths and try to get some of that information out.
Wow. Okay. That kind of like changed my life, because I had the flu.
Oh my God, everyone
had the flu. Yeah.
Everyone has the flu.
I'm glad I got it. So now it's like out of my system. But I was so stressed trying to look up medications. I think I spent an hour looking up the different ingredients in every over-the-counter flu medication before I Instacarted it.
And did you find any of those ingredients in the flu medications?
Like, I don't even know what I was reading. Like, because I was...
Were you reading like threads saying whether they were actually gluten-free or not? Or were you just reading the ingredients?
I was like reading the ingredients. I was putting them into ChatGPT. I was like, are there any traces of gluten in any of these ingredients? Like, because sometimes they say it's not going to say like wheat or barley, but it's like a different name that I can't even pronounce that might have it in it.
It will always be wheat, barley, rye, malt, or brewer's yeast. Okay. Those are the ingredients that we're looking for. And so when you see other ingredients, you really don't have to worry about those. Obviously, we talked about like malt vinegar, malt flavoring, but those are the ingredients you look for.
Okay. And I have a question about soy.
Yes, go ahead.
Because I think sometimes this confuses people a lot, because soy sauce famously has gluten in it unless you get a gluten-free version. But soy in and of itself, is
Fine.
that totally fine?
Totally fine. It's just
Okay.
the soy sauce that everyone gets scared of.
Okay, yeah. For a couple of years, if anything said like may contain soy on it, I didn't eat it because I was like, oh, it says gluten, which is just not true.
Right. Not true.
Okay. Wow, we're debunking so many myths today.
Yeah.
And do you think that some people unknowingly continue to gluten themselves?
I guess that's my job, right? Like that's kind of what I do each day is go through their diet and see if there's gluten in there. Mm-hmm. I do have a very motivated population because they're coming to the Celiac Disease Center and they, are seeking out celiac specialist care. So a lot of them have done their research, but we spend a lot of time going through the misinformation online or from other individuals and debunking what those are. So I think people mostly do know. I mean, I think a lot of people know how to be gluten-free. They know where gluten comes from. There's just like things here and there, like, all the medications have gluten and, they don't. So oftentimes my goal is to make them less crazy.
Okay, love that. I'm curious, have you ever dealt with like any pushback from a patient that's a bit hesitant to even follow the gluten-free diet?
Oh, yeah.
You have?
Oh,
okay.
For sure. Yeah, I think it's very surprising for compliant patients to hear that other people cheat on the diet. There are absolutely people who don't want to follow the gluten-free diet. They might not have symptoms. They don't feel motivated to follow it. And I mean, when you don't have symptoms, it's a blessing and a curse. You don't feel as motivated. But as I said, I do see a pretty motivated population because they're ones who are coming to the Celiac Disease Center. Right. Now, there's also people in my personal life who are maybe not seeking out that kind of professional guidance, and they might be, even less motivated, and they might be eating things that maybe, are riskier or actually have gluten. So part of my job is motivational interviewing and explaining why they should be following a gluten-free diet and why it's so important for their health.
Yeah. Okay. So if we have a listener that's not compliant with the gluten-free diet, doesn't understand why they need to take it seriously, what would you say to them?
So, we talk about how it is an autoimmune disease and you are igniting this autoimmune reaction and inflammation. And that inflammation can have effects all over the body, all different organs. And just because you don't have symptoms now doesn't mean that you won't develop symptoms or other conditions down the line. So obviously, we talked about the osteopenia a little bit. So bone loss is silent. You're not feeling bone loss, but you're malabsorbing calcium and vitamin D. And so your bones can become more brittle. And eventually in an older age, you might be more likely to break a bone. So that's something that you could be at risk for. There's a lot of other conditions if you want me to get into the scary stuff. But there's a lot of reasons why it might not affect you as much right now, but in the long term, it's really important for your health.
Totally, totally. And I love what you said about how being symptom-free is both a blessing and a curse, because it's great because if you accidentally gluten yourself, hopefully you're not going to be spending all night in the bathroom or like having these really awful symptoms. But at the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, you could be just like unknowingly glutening yourself and having no idea about it, but still causing that harm to your long-term health.
Yeah, I get that question a lot from patients who don't have symptoms, like how am I supposed to know? But we also have other ways of tracking. So we track their antibodies, we track their intestinal healing. There are different tests now called like Gluten Detect. I don't know if you're aware of that. It's a stool and a urine test that looks at gluten peptides in their stool and urine. So we can see if they're getting exposed to higher levels of gluten through testing like that. So there are ways, and obviously, if they're gaining or losing weight or they're, looking at their bone density, there are signs of healing rather than just symptoms.
Interesting. Okay. I know we talked a little bit about this with social life, but I want to focus specifically on like dating and relationships, because you have this whole article that you did research on that I found so fascinating. I want to read some stats from it for the listeners.
Sure.
It's called The Impact of Celiac Disease on Dating, and the link is in your Instagram bio if people want to check it out. But okay, I have like 4 stats to read out. So 68.4% of those who had dated reported that celiac disease had a moderate or major impact on their dating life, which makes sense, I think. 28.2% engaged in riskier eating behaviors to avoid awkwardness, which makes me so sad. 7.5% intentionally ate gluten on dates. That blows my mind. And 39% were hesitant to kiss a partner because of celiac disease concerns. So I just found this to be so interesting as someone that's currently dating and has celiac disease. I don't know if it's, different being a guy or a girl or, whoever it may be. I think every experience is different. But what do you tell people that, if you're talking to a patient that comes to you and they're like, oh, I went on a date and I just ate the burger with the regular bread because I was too nervous to talk about it on the date. What would you say to them?
Yeah, so I think this lends itself perfectly to what you just asked. Are there people who are pushing back and eating gluten? And so my answer before was yes. And I think what's really important and part of my job is figuring out the why. So why are you tempted to eat gluten? Is it because you're going on dates and you feel uncomfortable and you want to eat the gluten so that you don't feel like you're a burden? And so this really comes up as part of reasons why someone might not be compliant with the diet. And I'm always asking about the situations when they ended up eating gluten. Did they end up too hungry and then they were so tempted that they just had to eat something? Was it social pressures? And so there's a ton of studies on dining out and the difficulties with dining out and the pressures with dining out, but there weren't any studies on dating and dining out and celiac disease. And we know that there's even more pressure with dating and the interactions between two partners rather than maybe just your friend or your family when you're dining out. And so I talk with my own friends about their dating experiences, and I love talking about it and helping them find solutions, which is part of the reason why I got into counseling. In another life, I would love to be a matchmaker. And so I found that, if they were having all of these struggles, obviously our celiac disease patients or patients with dietary restrictions are probably having these same experiences and possibly even more stressful experiences because of that. So that's where this came out of. And I don't think too much, the fact that it has an impact, it's probably not surprising to you, but as you said, it's surprising and a little sad to see that people are being pressured into taking risks and potentially eating gluten. So really we kind of review why this happened, what was the reasons for it. Something that I really try to get across is that this is their treatment. We wouldn't expect someone who takes blood pressure medication not to take their blood pressure medication. So we can't expect someone with celiac disease not to follow their gluten-free diet. And I want patients to be confident. It garners respect. We don't need to apologize for our dietary needs and for our treatment. So I want patients to feel comfortable following their diet and having them understand that that's part of them. There's a lot of different tips I give around it, obviously being proactive and prepared and maybe suggesting certain restaurants that they feel comfortable with, or calling ahead, like I said, or talking to the waiter or getting there a little bit early. Something else that's different too that I feel like is something I want to relay to my patients is just because maybe your date doesn't necessarily understand at first, or maybe they come off as a little bit rude or dismissive, they are probably learning about this for the first time, and you're the one who's educating them. So it is possible they could become more understanding and more supportive. Obviously, it's possible they might not, and that is not the right person for you. But it is something that, people need to learn. I'm sure when you were first diagnosed, I know when I was first diagnosed, I did not know that much about celiac disease. I wasn't taught celiac disease even as a nutritionist. So it's something that we've really come to understand through lived experiences, but the partner or your date might need a little bit more information and background and practice to be able to support you in the way that you want them to.
Yeah, totally. Wow, that's such great advice. I love that. And I wonder too, I think maybe this is where New York City privilege comes into play, because I do think a lot of people in the city know about celiac disease. I just had a first date on Tuesday and it was a dinner date.
Love it.
And I never tell someone that I'm gluten-free before unless it just naturally comes up. I looked up the restaurant. I didn't really see any options, but I was just whatever, I'll figure it out when I get there. So I did not take the preparedness advice. And then I get there and I think I was coming from a gluten-free content creation event. So I just like mentioned in passing as I was sitting down, like, oh, I was at this event, like kind of work related. And then it came up that I was gluten-free. And then I guess I just kind of got lucky on that particular date that the guy that I was on a date with was like, oh, you're gluten-free. I didn't know that. Like, let me ask if they have gluten-free options. And then he like asked the like waiter for me and like turns out his roommate had celiac disease. So he knew all about it. So it was very easy.
Amazing.
But I think that's also because I live in New York. Like I assume that the restaurant will probably have something at least I can eat.
Right.
And I also assume that the person that I want to date with will be understanding about it.
Yeah. And if they don't, then it's probably not the person for you.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I think in the study, we asked the participants, when do they tell a date that they have celiac disease or that they follow a gluten-free diet? And some people did say that they tell them before the first date. Some people will wait till like 1 to 3 dates in. Some people not till after a 4th date or only once a relationship is established. So it really depends on the person. You know, some people want to suggest drinks or like activities first to get to know the person, and other people want them to know. They want, this is who I am, and this is, you're going to need to accept this. I need to have a safe meal. So it really, everyone adapts to the diet and their lifestyle differently. And I think, in the study, we found that some people found it had a major impact and it affected their quality of life to a bigger degree. And other people found that it was really not that big of a deal for them.
Yeah, I think it also depends, like, for how long you've had celiac or been gluten-free. Because since I've had it for 15 years, it's just such a part of me. I'm like, okay, like, this is me. Like, if this isn't your vibe or you aren't okay with this, then, like, whatever. Right. So I'm not going to be, like, ashamed of it. Yeah. But I can totally understand how it could be different if this is, like, a new thing for you and it still makes you nervous going out to restaurants. So, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, I know we're almost at time, but I want to get through our listener questions. So someone is asking, would I be at a disadvantage following a vegetarian diet?
So not a disadvantage. Good for you if you want to follow a vegetarian diet. But that is something that I would work on with you in terms of making sure you're getting enough protein, iron, B vitamins, because a lot of animal products have more of those nutrients in them. So we would find out, can we work together to get enough of that through food, or is supplementation necessary? So for example, a lot of vegans do need to take B12 supplements. So you can absolutely follow a vegetarian diet. You just have to be more intentional about it.
Totally. Cool. Okay, this is a specific question, but is Caputo flour and King Arthur wheat starch products considered celiac safe?
Yeah. Those, I feel like they've been sweeping the nation. Everyone is using modified wheat starch these days. But both of those, yes, they have been tested to be below 20 parts per million, so they are safe.
Amazing. Oh, this is an interesting one. I feel like I'm a lot hungrier now that I've been diagnosed and figuring out this new diet.
So that could probably be for 2 reasons. One, it might be that they haven't fully healed yet, and so they're not absorbing all of their nutrients yet. And 2, it might be because all of a sudden we've wiped out a big portion of their diet and they're struggling to figure out what to eat. And so they might be eating a little bit less as they come to figure out, what snacks are gluten-free and how they can nourish their bodies with enough carbohydrates that are gluten-free. So my guess is it would probably be related to that. And as they fully heal, your absorption rate is as normal as anyone without celiac disease. So your hunger will probably adjust with time.
Okay, amazing. And could being on a gluten-free diet make you more reactive to when you get gluten? Like, let's say someone was not diagnosed with celiac disease, didn't really have symptoms, and now that they're gluten-free, they get gluten and they feel more reactive.
Absolutely. So it is an unfortunate reality. It's not for everyone, but definitely when you go on a gluten-free diet, you're taking gluten out of your diet. I often say to patients that a vegetarian who all of a sudden eats a steak, a lot of times that doesn't go very well, but that doesn't mean they're intolerant.
My vegetarian friends, when they accidentally even have like beef stock.
Exactly.
They're throwing up.
Exactly. Yeah. So you can get pretty sick because their bodies are not used to digesting that anymore, and the bacteria in their microbiome aren't used to digesting that. So it's not that they have an intolerance to meat or beef stock or steak or anything like that. So same thing with gluten. If you've taken it out for a long time, obviously you will have that autoimmune reaction, but it also could just be that you haven't eaten it in so long, your body's not used to digesting it, so you may have stronger reactions.
Okay, interesting. And I know this is kind of like a blanket thing and it could be very individual, but are there any common nutrition deficiencies related with celiac disease outside of like maybe the calcium and the bone density that you've seen?
Yeah, definitely. So the major ones that we look at are vitamin D, B12, folate, and iron. Those are the things that we check for most regularly. And patients can definitely become, either when they're first diagnosed, they might be deficient in those things, or over time on a gluten-free diet, you can be more at risk for developing those because the gluten-free foods are not fortified in the same way as wheat-based products are. So those are things that we really look for in our labs. And when I'm going through a diet, I'm looking through all of that to make sure you're eating enough foods that have those nutrients in there. With my colleagues at Columbia, we published micronutrient considerations for celiac disease. It has a huge guide, probably best for practitioners, but it goes through like labs and lab values to look at for those nutrients and when to consider supplementation and how much supplementation for each of those nutrients.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I was going to follow up if you think that supplements can be beneficial. Does it depend on the person?
Yeah, so I generally lean less is more. So I don't say, you should take supplements if you don't have a need for them. But if you are low in certain nutrients and, low enough at these thresholds that we kind of developed, then I would definitely recommend nutrient supplementation based off of that.
Okay. I take a lot of supplements. I might need to revisit them.
We can look through.
I need all of them.
The supplement industry is not regulated very well. So there is more risk of trace gluten or pharmaceuticals being in supplements. There absolutely can be benefits to supplements, but I generally don't like to overdo it because of those risks, especially for celiac patients.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay. Wow. Thank you so much for just such an amazing conversation. You're a wealth of knowledge, and I feel like we need to do a part 2 already. There's so many questions I didn't even get to, but I feel like I learned so much from this episode, and I know that our listeners and community have learned so much too. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, I just want to end with one last question on a hopeful note, because I know you're obviously so involved in the celiac space and traveling and, going to different conferences to discuss this. So you're really at the forefront of everything. What gives you hope looking into 2026 for the future of celiac care?
So I think there's just so much research being done. Like you mentioned, these conferences. At each conference, there is rooms and rooms and days of research that is focused on celiac disease, that people are studying anything from medications to quality of life to apps and resources that can help patients to programs. I know they just I just got news that college guidelines are going to be published in a journal for celiac disease patients. So there's just so much going on, probably behind the scenes that isn't on social media, that trying to make patients' lives better with celiac disease.
That's amazing. Well, hopefully some new studies to look forward to reading.
Absolutely.
I love that. All right. Well, thank you again. Where can everyone follow you, learn more from you, and work with you?
Yeah. So you can follow me. I'm at gfree_RD, mostly on Instagram, a tiny bit on TikTok, not really. And then I work at Columbia Celiac Disease Center. I also work privately with outside patients through my own private practice, Jessica Nutrition. And then I have been giving more information in a different format lately through a new dinner club that we started that focuses on digestive health. All dinners are fully gluten-free since, as I mentioned, I'm celiac disease too, and want to make sure that everyone is eating safely and talking about these topics, different topics, including like bloating, constipation, avoiding restrictive eating. We actually have an event coming up for Valentine's Day because, as I said, I'm kind of obsessed with the dating space and celiac disease. So we're having a dating with dietary restrictions event, and It's called Belly Bestie Club. So we have information at Belly Bestie Club. So just a fun way for anyone to get involved and to come to these small, intimate dinners and learn about nutrition, about digestive health, and also meet other people in this community.
Wait, so fun. I love that. If I'm in town, I need to go.
Absolutely. We'd love to have you.
Yay. Okay, well, thank you again. And thank you all for listening. Don't forget to follow the show, leave us a 5-star review, and send this episode to a friend. And I will see you guys here next Wednesday. Bye. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Celiac Diaries podcast. I hope you're leaving with a tip, a story, or just a little inspiration to live your best life with celiac. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow the show, share it with a friend, or leave a review. I'll see you back here next Wednesday. And until then, stay well.